pray. Let's give a nice welcome to Phil Heimlich.
I was at a conference about a month ago. It was something called Patriot Pastors. You've probably been to these. They have them all over the country. Very prominent speakers, Mike Huckabee and people like that. And the message at this conference to the hundreds of pastors that attended was that you have an obligation to encourage your congregations to vote for conservative candidates, to get involved and support conservatives. In fact, when you think about it, what the real message was is that God, when it comes to politics, is a conservative. Now, why is that? Well, because if we're being exhorted to act a certain way, the Bible tells us that we're to be imitators of Christ, right? So therefore, the obvious message is that God is a conservative. And that if Jesus were here today, he'd be down at the school board demanding prayer in the classroom. He'd be at the county courthouse insisting that they put the Ten Commandments on a monument, right? If Jesus were here today, he'd be itching to get to the polls to vote out those liberals. That was really the message of this conference. Are those leaders who essentially are telling us that God is a political conservative. Is that true? I, as a conservative, as a Republican, as one who's been supported by all these organizations, have come to the conclusion that this is false doctrine, that it is not true, and that those who promote this doctrine are what the Bible calls false prophets. The problem I have with this is that there are 300 verses in the Bible where God expresses concern about the poor and social justice. I've been to a lot of rallies and events with the so-called Christian right and with conservatives. I have yet to hear one conservative politician talk about helping the poor. I have yet to hear it. Another issue, health care. My impression is, from my conversations and from what I've heard, virtually every Christian in politics has been opposed to this whole national health care thing. Absolutely opposed to it. In fact, the way when you listen to them, it almost sounds like it's a tool of the devil, doesn't it? But can we deny the fact that there are 44 verses in the Bible that talk about healing? Jesus healed 17 separate incidents where Jesus healed the sick. Now, given that, it is hard for me to believe that God is not troubled by the fact that 50 million people in this country don't have health care. What does God think about a country that is $62 trillion in the hole, which we are now when you include Medicare and Social Security commitments and the national debt? Because the Bible says that the borrower is servant to the lender. It says in Deuteronomy, you shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. Well, our country right now is in hock to the Chinese and a bunch of other foreign governments to the tune of $2.7 trillion. There's another premise that has been promoted. This one is that America was founded as a Christian nation and that we have to restore America to its Christian roots. You've heard this. But the fact is, that's not true. The people who founded this country came from Christian countries. They came from top-down, church-led countries where the leaders told you what the religion was supposed to be. That's why they came here. The foundational document of this country is the Constitution. With all due respect, it doesn't mention God, Jesus, Christianity, a supreme being, or any of that. It does say in the Constitution there will be no religious test for any government office or position. And just to be clear, just so there was no doubt about it, the Founding Fathers passed the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise. How could it be any clearer? Pat Robertson says our aim as Christians is to gain dominion over society. Well, that is not only bad history, that is bad doctrine. And it's bad doctrine because, yes, God desires a Christian country. But he desires a Christian country based on individuals choosing to accept Christ, not being forced down on them, like in the time of Constantine, when the emperor sent soldiers throughout the Roman Empire holding a bayonet in front of people and telling them, get baptized or else. We see this take dominion theory played out in the issue of school prayer. That's a big one, isn't it? We got to have prayer in the public schools. Jesus had something to say about public prayer, didn't he? He said that when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray in public, to be seen by men. Another myth. We Christians are a persecuted minority. You've heard this. In fact, we're told there's a war on Christianity now. We're an oppressed people. If we're an oppressed people, then explain to me why every Republican candidate for president in 2012, 2 months ago, paraded themselves in front of the Value Voters Summit begging for support. Who wants the support of an oppressed minority? The fact of the matter is, at least in the Republican Party, those of us, if you will, the Christian right is probably the most powerful force. And if you do not have their support, forget it. You can't get the nomination. One difference between we Christians in politics and Jesus is we don't have any problem with hypocrites. It doesn't bother us at all. Take Senator David Vitter. He's the man who introduced the constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage, the marriage amendment. Well, Senator Vitter, it turns out, is a client of the D.C. Madam, which is a nice term for a high-priced hooker. The ultimate example. Dr. George Riekers, co-founder of the Family Research Council. Dr. Riekers is an expert on the dangers of homosexuality. He testifies in front of legislative bodies for up to $120,000 in fees on the dangers of homosexuality and why gay couples shouldn't be allowed to adopt. And I'm not here to argue that issue. It turns out, a few months ago, Dr. Riekers returned from a European vacation in the company of a 20-year-old male prostitute who he recruited on rentboy.com. Those of us on the Christian right are not pro-life. We are anti-abortion. There's a book, The Abandonment of the Jews, by a Christian named David Wyman, and here's what he concluded. He said, in the Holocaust, he said, America's Christian churches were silent in the face of the Holocaust. No major denomination spoke out. Few of the many Christian publications cried out for aid to the Jews. Few even reported news of the extermination. And you may say, oh, but that was before the pro-life movement. You know, in 1973, the pro-life movement started. 1994, Rwanda, 800,000 people butchered with machetes, no less. 8,000 a day. What did our pro-life leaders say about this? It was on the nightly news. Best we can tell, they didn't say anything. You see, the hard truth is, within the pro-life movement, we're very passionate about the unborn, and we should be. But when it comes to born people, we don't care that much. The only exception, I don't know why, is if you're on a feeding tube, everybody gets pumped up about that. The hard truth is that we have turned the gospel into a political movement. We have sent the message out that unless you are with us on these issues, you're not welcome in the kingdom. The last thing that Jesus said, he said, make disciples of all men. True prophets understand what that means. But false prophets believe that we need to force disciples of all men through government edict. I think it is time that we stop listening to the false prophets and start listening to the true ones. Thank you.